The elevator shuddered to a halt between floors, and Clara Mills pressed herself against the cold metal wall, trying to make herself invisible. The man across from her, tall, imposing, wearing an expensive charcoal suit that probably cost more than her rent, hadn't said a word since they'd stepped inside together. His dark eyes were calculating, distant, and there was something about the way he carried himself that made her instinctively step back. Evan Calder checked his platinum Rolex for the third time in 5 minutes. The storm outside was wreaking havoc on the city's electrical grid, and he had transfers to complete before midnight. Christmas Eve meant nothing to him except tighter deadlines and fewer people to handle problems when they arose. The woman beside him was trying not to panic, but he could hear her shallow breathing, see the way her fingers trembled as she fumbled with her phone, searching for a signal that wouldn't come. She wore a thin coat that offered little protection against Philadelphia's brutal winter, and her shoes were worn at the heels. Details most people wouldn't notice, but Evan Calder noticed everything. When her phone finally rang, cutting through the suffocating silence, Clara answered with forced cheerfulness. "Hi, yes, this is Clara Mills. I see. No, I understand. Thank you anyway." She hung up and stared at the floor, her composure cracking just enough for Evan to recognize the look in her eyes. He'd seen it in mirrors for years, the particular emptiness that came with having nowhere to go and no one waiting. Welcome to Passion and Power, where love meets danger in the most unexpected places. Tonight's Christmas story will warm your heart and keep you on the edge of your seat. Comment below where you're watching from and hit that subscribe button. Your support means everything to us during this holiday season. The rescue team finally freed them at 9:47 p.m., and the building had transformed into a ghost town. Security guards made their final rounds while cleaning crews packed up early for the holiday. Clara stood in the marble lobby, watching through floor-to-ceiling windows as snow continued to fall in thick, relentless sheets across downtown Philadelphia. She pulled out her phone and scrolled through her contacts, a pathetically short list that reminded her how small her world had become. Her mother's number was still there, and Clara's thumb hovered over it for a moment before reality crashed back. Margaret Mills had been gone for 8 months now, and the house Clara had grown up in belonged to someone else. The few friends she'd managed to keep were either traveling to see family or had their own holiday traditions that didn't include a struggling administrative assistant with nowhere to go. Clara had been too proud to ask anyway, too tired of being the charity case who needed rescuing. She'd planned to spend Christmas Eve at the women's shelter on Broad Street, not ideal but warm and safe. The phone call in the elevator had eliminated even that option. No beds available, and with the storm intensifying, other shelters across the city were full too. Clara gathered her small duffel bag and walked toward the building's entrance, where she could see the security guard preparing to lock up. Maybe she could find an all-night diner, nurse a coffee until morning, and figure out her next move when the storm passed. "Miss?" The voice behind her was low, controlled, and carried an authority that made her turn around immediately. Evan Calder stood near the elevator bank, his white dress shirt pristine despite the evening's chaos, the top 4 buttons undone in a way that suggested confidence rather than carelessness. A discreet tattoo was visible on the side of his neck, elegant script in what looked like Italian. "The storm's getting worse," he said, his dark eyes studying her face. "Roads are closing. Public transport stopped running an hour ago." Clara nodded, unsure why he was telling her things she already knew. "I'll manage. Thank you for your concern." She turned back toward the exit, but his voice stopped her again. "Where are you going?" The question was direct, almost invasive, but something in his tone made her answer honestly. "I'm not sure yet. I'll find somewhere." Evan watched her for a long moment, taking in the worn coat, the small bag that contained everything she owned, the way she held herself with dignity despite her circumstances. He recognized the pride that kept her chin up and her voice steady, the same pride that had carried him through his own dark nights years ago. His phone buzzed with messages from his security team. 3 black SUVs waited outside, engines running, ready to take him to his estate in Chestnut Hill, where a housekeeper had left dinner warming, and every room was heated to perfect comfort. He could be home in 20 minutes, back to his routine of solitary meals and business calls that never stopped. But something made him pause. Maybe it was the way she'd thanked the shelter worker on the phone despite being turned away. Maybe it was the careful way she'd avoided eye contact in the elevator, trying not to impose even in a space they were forced to share. Or maybe it was simply that Christmas Eve had always been the loneliest night of the year for him, and for the first time in decades he wasn't the only person in this building with nowhere to go. "You stay with me." The words came out quietly, matter-of-factly, as if he was stating the weather rather than inviting a stranger into his home. Clara's eyes widened. "I'm sorry, what? You heard me." Evan's expression remained neutral, businesslike. "I have space. You need shelter. It's practical." She stared at him, trying to process the offer. Everything about Evan Calder screamed danger, from the way other people in the building had given him a wide berth, to the expensive watch on his wrist, to the subtle bulge under his suit jacket that suggested he carried protection most people didn't need. "I don't even know your name," Clara said carefully. "Evan Calder." He didn't offer his hand or any other pleasantries. "And you're Clara Mills. I heard your phone conversation." The fact that he'd been listening should have alarmed her, but Clara was too exhausted to feel anything except a bone-deep weariness. Outside, the wind howled against the windows, and she could see that the snow was already several inches deep on the sidewalks. "Why would you help me?" she asked. Evan considered the question for a moment. "Because I can." It wasn't a romantic gesture or a kind impulse. It was a statement of capability, of power exercised without emotion. Clara understood that she was being offered a transaction, shelter in exchange for what exactly? She wasn't naive enough to think it came without strings. "What do you want in return?" "Nothing." The answer was immediate and delivered with the same flat certainty as everything else he'd said. "Separate rooms, separate lives. You stay warm and safe until the storm passes, and you can make other arrangements." Clara looked toward the exit again, where snow was now piling against the glass doors. She thought about her mother's voice, the last conversation they'd had before the cancer took her. "Clara, honey, sometimes pride is just fear wearing a fancy dress. Don't let it keep you from accepting help when you need it." She turned back to Evan Calder, this dangerous stranger who was offering her exactly what she needed, without asking for her story or her gratitude. "Okay," she said quietly. "Thank you." Evan nodded once and pulled out his phone. "Joao, bring the car around, we're leaving now." As they waited for his driver, Clara wondered what she was walking into. But as the storm raged outside and warmth beckoned ahead, she realized that for the first time in months, she wasn't facing the night alone. The ride through Philadelphia's snow-covered streets was silent, except for the soft hum of the heated seats and the occasional crackle of the radio as Evan's driver, Joao, received updates about road conditions. Clara sat in the back of the black Range Rover, trying not to stare at the luxury surrounding her. Leather seats softer than anything she'd ever owned, a partition that could provide privacy at the touch of a button, and technology she couldn't even identify. Evan sat across from her, his attention focused on his phone, as he handled what sounded like business calls despite the late hour. His voice was low and controlled, but Clara caught fragments that made her stomach tighten. "Tell Vincent the timeline doesn't change because of weather." "No. The shipment goes out tomorrow regardless. Handle it quietly." She pressed herself against the window and watched the city transform under the storm. Downtown Philadelphia looked like a Christmas card, historic buildings outlined in snow, shop windows glowing with holiday displays, and the occasional couple hurrying down sidewalks bundled against the cold. It was beautiful and peaceful. Nothing like the tension filling the vehicle. When they turned into an exclusive neighborhood, where houses sat behind iron gates and circular driveways, Clara realized she was entering a world she'd only seen in magazines. Evan's estate appeared through the snow like something from a movie, a sprawling stone mansion, with warm light spilling from tall windows and a front entrance that could have accommodated a small wedding. "This is your house?" Clara asked, the first words she'd spoken since leaving downtown. "One of them." Evan's response was casual, as if owning multiple mansions was as ordinary as having multiple pairs of shoes. Joao pulled up to the front entrance, and Clara saw two men in dark coats emerge from somewhere near the garage. They moved with purpose and awareness, that suggested they were more than gardeners or maintenance staff. Security, she realized. Evan Calder lived like someone who expected threats. Inside, the house was even more impressive and more intimidating. The foyer featured a chandelier that probably cost more than Clara's annual salary, marble floors that gleamed under soft lighting, and a staircase that curved upward like something from a palace. Everything was perfectly appointed but somehow cold, as if it had been designed for photographs rather than living. Mrs. Chen left dinner in the kitchen, Evan said, shrugging out of his coat. She's off until after New Year's, so it's just us. Clara noticed how he moved through the space, comfortable but alert, like a man who owned everything he surveyed but never fully relaxed. The white dress shirt he wore was perfectly tailored, and she found herself noticing the way it fit across his broad shoulders, the glimpse of muscled chest visible where those 4 buttons remained undone. "I can show you to a room," he continued, "or you can eat first. Your choice." The offer of food made Clara realize she hadn't eaten since lunch, but accepting felt like crossing another line into dependency. "I'm fine, thank you. If you could just point me toward wherever I'll be staying." Evan studied her for a moment, and Clara had the unsettling feeling that he could see right through her polite deflection to the hunger and exhaustion underneath. "Kitchen's this way," he said, ignoring her protest entirely. The kitchen was a chef's dream. Granite countertops, professional-grade appliances, and enough space to feed an army. Mrs. Chen had left what looked like enough food for 6 people: roasted chicken, garlic mashed potatoes, green beans with almonds, and fresh bread that still smelled like it had come from the oven. "She always cooks too much," Evan said, pulling plates from a cabinet. "Sit." It wasn't really a request, and Clara found herself obeying before she could think about it. She watched as he moved around the kitchen with surprising efficiency, plating food and pouring water from a pitcher that probably cost more than her monthly grocery budget. When he set a full plate in front of her, Clara's resolve crumbled. The food was incredible, better than anything she'd tasted in months, and she ate with an appreciation that she tried to hide but knew was obvious. "When did you last have a real meal?" Evan asked quietly. Clara looked up, embarrassed to be caught. "I eat." "That's not what I asked." She set down her fork, defensive. "I'm not a charity case, Mr. Calder. I work. I pay my bills. I just hit a rough patch." "Everyone hits rough patches." His tone was matter-of-fact rather than sympathetic. "Some people have resources to weather them. Others don't. It's not a moral failing." The kindness in his words, delivered without emotion or pity, almost undid her. Clara had spent months pretending everything was fine, that losing her mother and her home and her savings to medical bills was just a temporary setback she could handle alone. "Why are you doing this?" she asked again, because his earlier answer hadn't satisfied her. Evan was quiet for a long moment, cutting his chicken with precise movements. "I know what it's like to have nowhere to go on Christmas." Something in his voice suggested there was a story there, but Clara didn't push. They finished eating in comfortable silence, and she helped clear the dishes despite his protests. "Your room is upstairs," Evan said finally. "Second door on the right. There are clothes in the closet that should fit. Mrs. Chen keeps things for guests. Bathroom's connected. Lock the door if it makes you feel safer." The casual mention of a lock told Clara that he understood her wariness, that he wasn't offended by her caution. It was another small kindness that she hadn't expected. As they climbed the curved staircase, Clara noticed family photos lining the walls, or rather the absence of them. The artwork was beautiful and expensive, but there were no personal touches, no glimpses into Evan Calder's life beyond wealth and taste. The guest room was larger than Clara's entire apartment had been, with a king-sized bed covered in what felt like Egyptian cotton, a sitting area near tall windows, and a bathroom that belonged in a luxury hotel. On the bed, someone had laid out pajamas, a robe, and toiletries that were still in their packaging. "Mrs. Chen thinks of everything," Evan said, noticing Clara's surprise. "This is too much," Clara said softly. "I can't—" "You can." His interruption was gentle but firm. "Sleep. Tomorrow we'll figure out next steps." He turned to leave, then paused at the doorway. "Clara." "Yes?" "You're safe here. Whatever you might have heard about me, Whatever you think you know, you're safe." After he left, Clara stood in the middle of the opulent room, trying to process everything that had happened. 6 hours ago, she'd been facing the prospect of spending Christmas Eve on the streets. Now she was in a mansion that felt like a fortress, protected by a man whose very presence suggested danger. She walked to the window and looked out at the snow-covered grounds, where she could see the shadows of security personnel making their rounds. Evan Calder might be offering her shelter, but he was also a man who needed armed guards and multiple homes, and the kind of careful control that came with serious enemies. Clara touched the lock on the bedroom door, then decided to leave it open. If Evan had wanted to hurt her, he'd had plenty of opportunities already, and despite everything that frightened her about him, she believed his promise that she was safe. For the first time in months, Clara fell asleep without worrying about tomorrow. Clara woke to sunlight streaming through windows she didn't recognize, and the smell of coffee drifting from somewhere downstairs. For a moment, she lay still, disoriented by the luxury surrounding her. Silk curtains, a mattress that felt like sleeping on a cloud, and silence so complete it seemed impossible in a city. The clothes Mrs. Chen had left fit perfectly. Soft cashmere sweater, well-tailored jeans, and slippers that were probably worth more than Clara's entire wardrobe. She felt like she was playing dress-up in someone else's life. Downstairs, she found Evan in what appeared to be a home office, speaking quietly into a phone while typing on a laptop. He'd changed into dark jeans and a navy sweater that made his eyes look almost black. And Clara noticed again how the casual clothes did nothing to diminish his commanding presence. "The weather delayed everything by 12 hours, he was saying. "Adjust the timeline accordingly." No, Pierce doesn't get an extension. He knew the terms. At the mention of Pierce, Evan's voice hardened in a way that made Clara step back. She was about to retreat upstairs when he noticed her and gestured for her to wait. "Handle it," he said into the phone, then hung up. "Good morning. Coffee?" "I can make my own," Clara said quickly. "I don't want to impose." "You're not imposing." Evan stood and walked toward what she assumed was the kitchen. Mrs. Chen left instructions. Apparently, "I'm hopeless with anything more complicated than toast." Following him, Clara was struck again by the house's strange combination of luxury and emptiness. Every surface was perfect. Every room looked like it belonged in a magazine. But there were no signs of actual living. No books left open, no coffee rings on tables, no photographs of friends or family. "Do you always work on Christmas morning?" she asked as Evan poured coffee from an expensive-looking machine. "I always work." He handed her a mug that was probably worth more than her last paycheck. "Business doesn't stop for holidays." "What kind of business?" The question slipped out before Clara could stop herself, and she immediately regretted it when Evan's expression became unreadable. "Construction, transportation, import-export." His answers were technically accurate but deliberately vague. "Nothing that would interest you." Clara nodded, understanding that she'd reached a boundary. She sipped her coffee, which was incredible, and tried to think of safer topics. "The storm seems to have stopped," she observed, looking out at the snow-covered grounds. "Roads should be clear by this afternoon. Joanne can drive you wherever you need to go." The dismissal was polite but clear, and Clara felt a strange pang of disappointment. She'd known this was temporary, but somehow she'd expected. What? That a powerful man like Evan Calder would want her to stay longer? That one night of kindness meant anything beyond basic human decency. "Of course," she said. "I should probably start making some calls, see what options—" Evan's phone rang, interrupting her. He glanced at the screen and his jaw tightened. "I need to take this," he answered with a curt, "What?" And Clara watched his entire demeanor shift. The casual morning persona disappeared, replaced by something harder and more dangerous. "When?" he asked, his voice deadly quiet. "How many people know?" "I see." "No, don't do anything yet. I'm on my way." He hung up and stood motionless for a moment, his mind clearly racing through calculations Clara couldn't follow. "I have to go out," he said finally. "Stay in the house. Don't answer the door for anyone. Joa will be here and there are others watching the property." "Is everything okay?" Clara asked, though his expression made it clear that everything was very much not okay. "It will be." Evan's tone was confident. But Clara caught something else underneath, a tension that suggested whatever was happening was serious enough to worry a man who didn't seem to worry about much. He was already moving toward the door when Clara called after him. "Evan!" He turned back, and for a moment, his carefully controlled mask slipped. Clara saw something raw in his eyes, not fear exactly, but a recognition of stakes that went beyond business. "Be careful," she said softly. Something shifted in his expression, surprise maybe, as if he couldn't remember the last time someone had expressed concern for his safety. "I always am." After he left, Clara found herself alone in a house that felt more like a fortress. She explored carefully, noting the security cameras in every room, the reinforced windows, the way certain doors required key cards to open. This wasn't just wealth. This was protection against specific threats. She was reading in the library when Joe appeared in the doorway. He was younger than she'd expected, maybe 30, with the kind of alertness that suggested military training. "Miss Mills, Mr. Calder asked me to check on you. Everything okay?" "Fine, thank you." Clara hesitated, then asked, "Is he in danger?" "Evan, I mean." Joao's expression didn't change, but Clara caught the slight pause before he answered. "Mr. Calder can handle himself. He's been doing this a long time." "Doing what, exactly?" "Surviving," Joao said simply, and Clara understood that was all the information she was going to get. The afternoon stretched on with no word from Evan. Clara tried to read, tried to watch television, tried not to think about the fact that she was worried about a man she barely knew. But as evening approached, and he still hadn't returned, she found herself checking the windows and jumping at every sound. When headlights finally swept across the driveway at nearly 8 o'clock, Clara felt a relief that surprised her with its intensity. She watched from an upstairs window as Evan emerged from the Range Rover, moving with his usual controlled grace but carrying tension in his shoulders that hadn't been there that morning. He found her in the kitchen, where she'd been pretending to read while actually listening for his return. "Everything handled?" she asked, trying to keep her voice casual. Evan studied her face, and Clara had the feeling he could see right through her attempt at nonchalance. "For now." "Good." She closed her book and stood up. "I should probably pack. I've imposed on your hospitality long enough. Where will you go?" The question was direct, and Clara realized she didn't have a good answer. The shelters would still be full, her savings account was nearly empty, and she hadn't had time to find new housing before the holidays. "I'll figure something out," she said, the same words she'd used in the building lobby the night before. Evan was quiet for a long moment, his dark eyes never leaving her face. When he finally spoke, his voice was softer than she'd heard it before. "You don't have to leave tonight." "Evan, the roads are still dangerous. The city's a mess. One more night won't hurt anything." Clara wanted to argue, to maintain her independence, to prove she didn't need rescuing. But the truth was that she did need rescuing, at least temporarily, and Evan was offering it without conditions or judgment. "Okay," she said quietly. "One more night." As she headed upstairs, Clara caught Evan watching her with an expression she couldn't quite read. There was something different in his eyes, not pity or desire, but a kind of recognition, as if he saw something in her that surprised him. What Clara didn't know was that downstairs, Evan was making a decision that would change both their lives. The threat he'd dealt with that day had been neutralized, but it had also shown him something he hadn't expected. For the first time in years, he had something to lose. Clara woke on December 26th to the sound of raised voices downstairs. She checked the bedside clock, 6:23 a.m., and felt her stomach clench with anxiety. In her experience, nothing good happened when people were arguing before dawn. She pulled on the robe Mrs. Chen had provided and crept to the top of the stairs, where she could hear Evan's voice, low and controlled, but carrying an edge that made her shiver. "I don't care what Pierce thinks he knows," Evan was saying. "He's fishing. He has nothing concrete. He has enough to make trouble," another voice replied. "Jomo," Clara realized, and now he's asking questions about the woman. Clara's blood turned to ice. They were talking about her. What kind of questions? Evan's voice had gone deadly quiet. "Who she is, where she came from, why you're protecting her. He's trying to figure out if she's leverage." She's not leverage, she's nobody. Evan's words hit Clara like a physical blow, even though she understood he was trying to protect her. A random woman who needed help during a storm, that's all. Pierce doesn't see it that way. He thinks you've gone soft, that you're distracted. He's planning to use that against you in the negotiations. Clara heard footsteps and quickly retreated to her room, but not before catching Evan's response. Then Pierce is going to learn exactly how wrong he is. She sat on the edge of the bed, her hands shaking as the implications sank in. By accepting Evan's help, she'd inadvertently made herself a target. Worse, she'd become a weakness that his enemies could exploit. 20 minutes later, there was a soft knock on her door. Clara opened it to find Evan standing in the hallway, fully dressed in a dark suit despite the early hour. His expression was carefully neutral, but she could see the tension in his shoulders. "We need to talk," he said. Clara followed him downstairs to his office, where he closed the door and gestured for her to sit. She remained standing, her arms crossed defensively. "You heard," he said. "It wasn't a question. Enough." Clara's voice was steadier than she felt. "I'm putting you in danger just by being here. You're not putting me in danger. I am dangerous, Clara. There's a difference." "Is that supposed to make me feel better?" She turned away from him, staring out the window at the snow-covered grounds that suddenly felt more like a prison than a sanctuary. "I should never have come here. I should have known." "Known what?" Evan's voice was sharp. "That I'm not the kind of man who helps people out of the goodness of his heart. That there are always consequences to getting involved with someone like me?" Clara spun back to face him, anger flaring. "I didn't ask to get involved with you. I just needed a place to stay for one night, and now I'm apparently some kind of liability that your enemies want to use against you." "You're not a liability." Evan stepped closer, and Clara could see something roar in his dark eyes. "You're—" He stopped, seeming to struggle with words that didn't come easily to him. "I'm what?" Clara demanded. "You're the first person in years who's made me remember what it feels like to want to protect something other than territory and profit margins." The admission hung between them, vulnerable and dangerous. Clara felt her anger deflate, replaced by something more complicated and infinitely more frightening. "Evan," she said softly, "I can't be that for you. I can't be the reason you make decisions that could get you killed. It's too late for that." His voice was matter-of-fact, as if he was discussing the weather rather than upending both their lives. "Pierce already thinks you matter to me. The only question now is what we do about it." Clara's phone rang before she could respond. She glanced at the screen and frowned. Unknown number, but the area code was local. "Don't answer it," Evan said immediately, but Clara had already swiped to accept the call. "Hello?" "Miss Mills." The voice was smooth, cultured, and completely unfamiliar. "I hope you're enjoying your stay with Mr. Calder." Clara's eyes flew to Evan, who had gone perfectly still. He gestured for her to keep the caller talking while he pulled out his own phone. "I'm sorry, who is this?" Clara asked. "A concerned citizen. I understand you found yourself in a rather precarious situation. No family, no home, no resources. How fortunate that Mr. Calder was there to rescue you." The man's tone was pleasant, conversational, but Clara could hear the threat underneath. "What do you want?" "Nothing from you, my dear. You're simply an innocent bystander who happened to catch the attention of a very dangerous man. The question is whether you're smart enough to walk away before you get hurt." Evan had moved to his computer and was typing rapidly, his jaw clenched with controlled fury. "I think you have the wrong number," Clara said carefully. "I don't think so. You see, Miss Mills, men like Evan Calder don't form attachments. They acquire assets, and assets, unfortunately, have a tendency to become liabilities when they're no longer useful." The line went dead. Clara stood frozen, the phone still pressed to her ear as Evan's words from the night before echoed in her mind. "You're safe here. Whatever you might have heard about me, whatever you think you know, you're safe." But she wasn't safe. She was a pawn in a game she didn't understand, played by men who viewed human lives as expendable resources. "That was Jonathan Pierce," Evan said, his voice tight with barely controlled rage. "He's trying to scare you into running." "Maybe I should run." Clara set down her phone with shaking hands. Maybe he's right about what happens to people who get too close to you. He's not right. Evan moved toward her, but Clara stepped back. How do you know? How many people have gotten hurt because they mattered to you? The question hit its mark. Clara saw something flicker across Evan's face. Pain, maybe, or guilt, before his expression hardened again. That's not going to happen to you, he said. You can't promise that. Yes, I can. Evan's voice carried absolute certainty. Because I'm going to end this today. Pierce wants to play games with innocent people. He's about to learn why that's a mistake. Clara felt a chill that had nothing to do with the winter weather. What are you going to do? What I should have done months ago. Evan was already moving toward the door. Joao will stay with you. Don't leave the house. Don't answer any calls from numbers you don't recognize, and don't... Evan, wait. Clara caught his arm, surprised by the warmth of his skin through the expensive fabric of his suit. Don't do anything you can't take back. He looked down at her hand on his arm, then up at her face, and Clara saw something shift in his expression. It was already too late for that. The moment I decided you mattered more than my own safety, he said quietly. Before Clara could respond, he was gone, leaving her alone with the terrifying realization that she mattered to him, and that in Evan Calder's world, mattering to someone could be the most dangerous thing of all. Clara spent the longest day of her life pacing Evan's house like a caged animal. Joe had tried to reassure her that everything would be fine, that Evan had handled worse situations, but his own tension was obvious in the way he constantly checked his phone and monitored the security feeds. By evening, Clara couldn't take the waiting anymore. She found Joao in the kitchen, cleaning a gun with methodical precision that suggested it was more nervous habit than necessity. How long has he been gone? She asked. Joao glanced at his watch. 14 hours. Is that normal? No. The admission was reluctant but honest. Usually these things are resolved much faster. Clara felt her stomach drop. What does that mean? It means Pierce is either dead or he's proving harder to find than expected. Joao's tone was matter-of-fact, as if discussing someone's death was routine. Either way, Mr. Calder will handle it. And if he doesn't? Clara asked quietly. Joao looked up from his weapon, his young face serious. Then you and I have bigger problems than waiting. At 11:47 p.m., headlights finally swept across the driveway. Clara ran to the window and watched as not one but 3 black SUVs pulled up to the house. Her heart hammered as she counted the figures emerging from the vehicles. Too many for just Evan and his usual security detail. Joao appeared beside her, his gun now holstered but his hand resting on it. Stay back from the windows. The front door opened, and Clara heard Evan's voice, low and controlled as he spoke to someone she couldn't see. There were other voices too, men discussing logistics and cleanup and things that made Clara's blood run cold. When Evan finally appeared in the kitchen doorway, Clara's first thought was relief that he was alive and apparently uninjured. Her second thought was that something fundamental had changed in his expression. The careful control was still there, but underneath it was something harder, more final. "It's finished," he said simply. "Pierce?" Joao asked. "Won't be a problem anymore." Evan's tone discouraged further questions. Neither will his associates, who thought threatening innocent people was acceptable business practice. Clara understood that she was hearing a confession to murder, delivered with the same casual tone most people use to discuss dinner plans. She should have been horrified, should have been running for the door, should have been calling the police. Instead, she felt a complicated mix of relief and gratitude that terrified her more than any threat Pierce could have made. "What happens now?" she asked. Evan looked at her for a long moment, his dark eyes unreadable. "Now you're safe. Permanently. And you?" "I'm exactly what I've always been." He moved to the sink and began washing his hands with methodical thoroughness. "The only difference is that now everyone knows what happens when they threaten something that belongs to me." The possessive language should have offended Clara, should have triggered her independent streak and sent her storming out into the night. But there was something in the way Evan said it, not like she was property, but like she was precious, worth protecting at any cost. "I don't belong to you," she said quietly, testing the words. Evan turned off the water and faced her, his expression softer than she'd ever seen it. "No," he agreed. "You don't. But you matter to me, Clara. More than I thought possible. More than is probably smart for either of us." "Why?" The question came out as barely a whisper. "Because you looked at me in that elevator and saw a man, not a reputation. Because you trusted me when you had every reason not to. Because you worried about my safety, when no one has done that in years." Evan stepped closer, his voice dropping to something intimate and raw. "Because for the first time since I was a child, I spent Christmas with someone who made me remember what peace feels like." Clara felt tears prick her eyes. "Evan, I know what I am," he continued. "I know what I do, and I know the kind of life I can offer you. It's not normal, it's not safe, and it's not what you deserve. What if it's what I want?" The question surprised them both. Clara hadn't planned to say it, hadn't even realized she was thinking it until the words were out. But as she looked at this dangerous, complicated man who had protected her at considerable cost to himself, she realized it was true. "You don't know what you're saying," Evan said carefully. "Yes, I do." Clara stepped closer, close enough to see the faint scar along his jawline, the way his dark eyes reflected the kitchen lights. "I'm saying that I've spent my whole life playing it safe, following the rules, trying to be the good girl who never caused trouble. And where did it get me? Alone, broke, and sleeping in shelters. Clara?" "You saved me," she interrupted. "Not just from the storm, not just from Pierce, but from a life where I was invisible, where I didn't matter to anyone. Maybe your world is dangerous, but at least in it I exist." Evan reached up and touched her face, his thumb brushing away a tear she hadn't realized had fallen. "You exist everywhere, Clara. You just needed to find the right person to see you." "I found him," she said simply. For a moment, they stood frozen in the space between what was and what could be. Then Evan leaned down and kissed her, soft and careful and full of promise. When they broke apart, Clara could see something new in his expression. Hope, maybe, or the possibility of happiness he'd thought was lost to him forever. "You stay with me," he said, echoing his words from that first night in the lobby. But this time it wasn't a practical solution to a temporary problem. It was an invitation to a life neither of them had planned, but both of them wanted. "Yes," Clara whispered against his lips. "I stay with you." Outside, snow began to fall again, but inside Evan Calder's fortress, two people who had been alone for too long finally found their way home. Years later, Clara would look back on that Christmas Eve as the night her real life began. The woman who had been afraid to take up space, who had apologized for existing, was gone. In her place was someone who understood that love sometimes came wrapped in danger, that safety wasn't always about avoiding risk, but about finding someone worth taking risks for. Evan had kept his promise. She was safe, protected by his reputation and his resources. But more importantly, cherished by a man who had learned to value peace over power. He still conducted business with the same ruthless efficiency, but he came home to her every night, traded his armor for vulnerability, and built a life that had room for laughter and lazy Sunday mornings, and all the ordinary magic he'd thought was beyond his reach. They married the following Christmas, in the same house where she'd first felt safe. Clara wore her mother's pearl necklace and carried white roses, and when Evan promised to love and protect her for the rest of their lives, she knew he meant it with the same absolute certainty he brought to everything else. The guest room, where she'd spent those first uncertain nights, became a nursery, then a child's bedroom, then a teenager's sanctuary. Their daughter had Evan's dark eyes and Clara's stubborn independence, and she grew up understanding that her father was both feared and respected, but that at home he was just Dad, the man who read bedtime stories and taught her to drive and threatened to buy a small country if any boy ever broke her heart. Sometimes Clara wondered what would have happened if the elevator hadn't broken down, if the storm had passed, if she'd been too proud to accept help from a stranger. But then Evan would come home and kiss her hello, and she would remember that some coincidences were really just fate wearing a disguise. The woman who had nowhere to go for Christmas had found everything she'd never dared to dream of. And the man who had forgotten how to hope had learned that sometimes the most dangerous thing you could do was open your heart to love. And that's how a Christmas storm brought two lost souls together here at Passion and Power. Sometimes the most unexpected encounters lead to the greatest love stories. If this tale of second chances and dangerous devotion touched your heart, show some love by hitting that like button and subscribing for more passionate stories. Your support keeps these romantic adventures coming, and we can't wait to share the next one with you. Until then, remember, love finds a way, even in the most unlikely places.